There, now I'm recording, sorry. Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau Program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversations and critical thinking, and provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and many private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. I'd encourage you to visit their website, www.humanities.org, to find other events like this one. Okay, so thanks to Humanities Washington again. We got a couple people to get in. Thanks to Tessa Hulls. As I said, we are recording this. And Tessa Hulls, I'm going to let you talk about the program, but I'm going to talk about you as a multidisciplinary artist, writer, and outdoorswoman who focuses on women's stories. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post and Atlas Obscura's Kick-Ass Women's series. She's a frequent public lecturer and performer and has appeared at the Seattle Art Museum, Washington Ensemble Theater, Annex Theater, and other locations. And now she appears at the Hearthstone. Thank you for being here, Tessa. I'm going to shut up now and turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction and everyone for coming out today. If everyone could go ahead and mute just during the talk, that would be great because I can hear everything that you say. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, so I'm just going to jump in immediately to one of my favorite topics, which is women who simply refuse to do what their cultures expected of them. And the reason that I focus on the turn of the 20th century is because this is the era when reliable photographic documentation first becomes available. So it's not that this is when women suddenly started doing these things, it's just the first point at which we see evidence. So I actually want to kick us off by talking about communications technology. And for the purpose of this talk, this timeline begins in 1493 with the invention of the printing press. And for about the next 3 centuries, you know, there were technological advances, but it was at kind of a steady pace until the 1800s when we see an explosion of new technologies. So in 1816, the first fixed image camera is invented, and that's followed by the telegraph machine in the 1840s. And fun piece of trivia, the first telegraph ever sent contained the message, "What hath God wrought?" So they thought that this was just unfathomably advanced technology. And it's kind of fun to wonder what they would think of what's happening now. In 1876, the telephone was invented, followed by the moving film camera in 1886. And then at the very end of the century, we have the radio come along in 1895. And these are drawings of the first prototypes of each of these technologies. So those are accurate. The 7 women that I'm going to talk about this afternoon were all born during this period of technological innovation. And there's something that happens in the year 1900 that's a game changer. And if we were doing this in person, I would make all of you guess. But since we're doing this over Zoom, I'm just going to tell you that in the year 1900, Kodak releases the Kodak Brownie, and they market it on an ease of use and affordability platform, and they sell it for $1. So what this means is suddenly anyone can take pictures of their lives. And if we go and look at the original ads, you'll see right up there at the top, it says any school boy or girl. So these were gender inclusive from the outset. And we also see in those early ads pictures of women out using these cameras. So it really was targeted at both genders from the beginning. Importantly, the slogan of the Brownie was "Take along a brownie." And so what this new technology does is it changes access. And suddenly it's not only very wealthy people who can afford to have photo studios who are documenting their lives. And the whole idea of a camera changes, going from being seen as a bulky object that you would have to put in front of your fainting couch to being something very portable that you could just take with you when you went to go summit a mountain. And before this era, people who were going out and doing adventurous things, you know, it was only people who had the money to afford teams of porters to lug their stuff across the Himalayas who could take pictures of themselves in these extreme environments. But the Kodak Brownie really changed this. So all of the women that I'm going to talk about today were born in a year that begins in 18, and they all died in a year that begins in 19. And just to lend a little bit of context about what women's day-to-day lives were like during this era, at this point, women were not allowed to own property. They could not initiate a divorce. It was perfectly legal for a husband to beat his wife. One of my favorite illustrations of this is the saying rule of thumb. One of the stories as to where that phrase came from is that it was legal for a husband to beat his wife with a stick, so long as that stick was narrower than the width of his thumb. So just really want to contextualize kind of where things were for women's rights before telling you these stories. The first woman I want to talk about is Mary Kingsley. You can see her here in the middle of a dugout canoe in West Africa. And she just barely squeaks by this 1819 rule that I made because she died in the year 1900. So she was born into an immediate position of social stigma because her father was the head of a pretty well-to-do household and her mother was the household's nurse. And the two of them weren't married until 4 days after Mary was born. So her father dodged the embarrassment of his daughter by leaving, often for years at a time. And he's quoted as having said that he mistrusted intelligent women. So aside from teaching Mary to speak German so that she could help him with his translation work, he basically denied her access to an education. And she wrote, "I cried bitterly at not being taught things." But Mary was very intelligent and very resourceful, so she took advantage of her father's long absences by reading her way through his library. And in that manner, she was able to get a very well-rounded education about the outside world. Eventually, both of her parents died, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to take care of anyone. So she had a small inheritance, and she decided that she was going to go out to be an explorer. And she headed down to West Africa and joked in a letter to a friend that she was heading down there to die. But she absolutely did not die. She instead began a series of solo expeditions in West Africa, in the area we would now call Cameroon. And she held beliefs that ran counter to the ideology of British imperialism that was dominant in the day. She criticized missionary groups for denying the validity of indigenous belief systems, and she went so far as to say that they treated African people as, quote, an empty jug they could fill with their secondhand rubbishy white culture. So she obviously was not at all afraid to speak her mind, but she was pretty conservative in some other ways. And nowhere is that more apparent than in her form of dress. This is a picture of one of her typical outfits, and this is really not that far off from what she would wear when she was bushwhacking through the jungle. She also carried a dagger, and this was less for self-defense and more for to be able to commit suicide if she was captured by cannibals, because she wouldn't want to die in a way that was improper for a Victorian lady. My favorite story about her propriety is one time she fell into this 15-foot deep pit that was lined with poisonous snakes. And because she was wearing a thick dress, they didn't puncture her skin. So after she was pulled out, she's quoted as saying, "It is at these times you realize the blessing of a good thick skirt." The way that she was able to fund her expeditions was by collecting specimens for the British Museum, and she discovered a number of previously unknown species. These are three fish that all bear her name. You can see Kingslea as part of their scientific name down there in the caption at the bottom. And she also became a well-known author. She wrote Travels in West Africa in 1897, followed by West African Studies in 1899, and she eventually returned home and became a popular lecturer. She gave talks at the Scottish and Liverpool Geographical Societies, where she would sit silently on stage while a male member read her papers to the audience because a woman was not allowed to speak. She was eventually given permission to speak, but at first that was kind of the way of negotiating that tension of her being an academic specialist, but also a woman. Tragically, she died pretty young. She passed away at the age of 38 when she contracted typhoid on her third trip down to Africa. She was serving as a nurse for Afrikaans prisoners of war. And once she realized that she wasn't going to survive, she sent everyone away from her room and said that she wanted to die alone like an animal so that no one could see her weakness. Her wishes were honored and she was buried at sea. And today, the Mary Kingsley Society, which was later renamed the Royal African Society, was founded in her honor and continues to operate. This is Ada Blackjack, and she's the Nupiaq woman who was born near the gold rush town of Nome, Alaska. And even though she was ethnically Native Alaskan, she wasn't brought up in traditional ways. And so she was raised by missionaries who taught her just enough English to be able to read the Bible. When she was 16, she married a local dog musher by the name of Jack Blackjack. And unfortunately, he was not a great husband. They had 3 children, but 2 of them died quite young. And this is a picture of Ada with her one surviving son, Bennett. Unfortunately, Jack Blackjack abandoned them, and Ada was forced to walk 40 miles through the snow back to the nearest town to get help. And because Bennett at the time was only 3 years old, she had to carry him through the snow when he was too tired to walk. Unfortunately, Bennett had a lot of health problems. And even though it killed Ada to have to do this, she eventually placed him in an orphanage so that he could get the medical treatment he needed. And she swore that she would find a way to raise enough money to bring him back home. So the way that she found to do this came along in 1921 when an expedition organized by a charismatic Arctic explorer by the name of Wilhelmer Stephenson came through town looking for an Alaska Native seamstress who could sew the survival gear that these men would need. If you look on the far right-hand corner of this picture, you can see a small cat perched on the knee of one of these men. That's Vic, and she will come back into this story later. So at best, this expedition was an act of hubris. At worst, it was negligent beyond words, because Wilhelmer Stephenson basically sent in 4 ill-prepared men, and he told them that even though they were planning on going to Wrangel Island for 1 year, that they should only bring 6 months of supplies because the friendly Arctic would be an easy place to survive and would provide everything that they needed. Yeah, pretty, it's hard to wrap your mind around that, but that is how they set off. So this is a picture of their camp at Wrangel Island, which is a speck of gravel north of Siberia. And this is Ada. You can see her a little bit pixelated, standing in front of one of the tents. And initially things were going pretty well, but unbeknownst to them, Stephenson hadn't actually raised the money to send the ship that was supposed to pick them up 1 year later. And the way that things work in these high northern latitudes is that the ocean freezes solid each winter. So there's really a limited window of time where a ship can get in. So as the season was getting later and later and game was starting to disappear with seasonal shifts, the expedition realized that no one was coming to pick them up and that they were going to need to survive for another year. And things started to get pretty dire. This is a picture of Vic perched by a walrus skull in their camp. So one of the men became very ill, and the other 3 men decided that the best chance of survival, because they were starving at this point and were almost out of food, was for the 3 of them to try and walk across the frozen ocean to Siberia to get help. So the 3 men left. They were never seen again. Their bodies were never found and presumably died. And Ada was left behind with the one sick man whose name was Lorne Knight, and he was suffering from undiagnosed scurvy. So this is when Ada becomes just a total badass. She was afraid of guns and didn't know how to hunt, but she built a platform above the camp so that she could see polar bears coming on the horizon so they wouldn't sneak up on her. And she taught herself how to shoot. She also taught herself how to set trap lines. So she would go out each day to check her traps. There was even one anecdote where the boat that they bought had been destroyed in a storm. So she built a new boat out of driftwood and sealskins. And the men had brought photography equipment, and she even experimented with taking selfies. One of the men had also brought a typewriter, so each day before she would go out hunting and to check her traps, she would record to the best of her knowledge the date and time so that if she didn't come back, there would at least be a record for whoever eventually found them. Unfortunately, the sick man, Lorne Knight, took his anger and helplessness at his situation out on Ada and was pretty terrible to her, and he eventually passed away. So this is from Ada's journal about what that period of caring for Knight was like. He never stopped and think how much it's hard for women to take for a man's place, to woodwork and to hunt for something to eat for him, and to do wading to his bed and take the shit out for him. So she dutifully recorded the date of his death on the typewriter and then settled in to wait for a rescue ship. Eventually, Stephenson did get the funds together to send a ship. So over 2 years after they had set out, a ship did come to pick Ada up, and she went down to meet them wearing a resplendent new reindeer parka that she had sewn for herself. This is Ada on the deck of the Donaldson, which is the rescue ship, and you will notice that she is holding Vic the cat, who also came through this ordeal. So just to recap the score here, we had 4 men, 1 woman, and 1 female cat, and all 4 men died, and the woman and the cat were doing just fine. And the crew of the Donaldson noted, quote, Blackjack mastered her environment so far that it seems likely she could have lived there another year. Sadly, this story takes a bit of a sad turn. Once news of this tragic expedition got out, there was a lot of media attention and a lot of people started profiting off of the story. But Ada never saw any of that money, and she was also never paid anywhere near the amount that she had been promised. Where this becomes really tragic is a media smear campaign started against her, saying that she had been responsible for Lorne Knight's death because she hadn't adequately cared for him. And Ada was a very shy person by nature. She didn't like being in the spotlight. All she wanted was to be able to care for Bennett. So she did get enough money to take Bennett out of the orphanage, and they went down to Seattle where he received medical care, but he unfortunately never really recovered. And the only reason Ada broke her silence when all of this was happening is she wanted to try and clear her name. Um, she did manage to get some people on her side, especially the family of Lorne Knight really advocated for her. But she eventually just kind of lapsed into obscurity, and she passed away fairly anonymous in a nursing home in Palmer, Alaska. She was at least buried by her son Bennett's side. This is Fanny Quigley, and the story of how I discovered her is my favorite of all the women in these talk. I was on a 600-mile bike ride in middle of nowhere, Alaska, and there's a one winding gravel road that runs 95 miles into Denali National Park and then just dead ends in the middle of nowhere. And way out at the end of that road, there is a small cabin, and that cabin happened to have a historical placard. And so that's how I learned that it was Fanny Quigley's cabin. And I became so fascinated by her story that I just kept researching once I got back to things like libraries and the internet. So stories of the Alaskan gold rush are pretty much dominated by men, but hidden amongst all those men is one 5-foot tall, 100-pound frontierswoman who did everything that the men did, only better. She wore men's clothing, drank heavily, swore loudly, and shot bears. But unlike the men, she was using her bear lard to make the crusts of her legendarily flaky rhubarb pies. So this is Fanny out in Alaska with rhubarb harvested from her garden. She was born in Wahoo, Nebraska, into a community of Czech-speaking immigrants. And when she was 16, she headed out west with the railroad expansion. And the way that she did this is she took jobs as a railroad cook and would just move with the railroad as the camps progressed further and further west. And this is where she learned to speak English, which is maybe why she had a reputation for swearing like a sailor. So this is a quote about her language. Figurative language that was fairly Shakespearean in its rugged raciness. So after she got to the West Coast, she followed the gold rush up north, first landing in Canada, and there she earned the nickname Fanny the Hike. The way that she ended up with that nickname is when new mining claims would happen, all of the men would stampede in trying to lay claim to the land first. And Fanny had the suspicion that they maybe would not be totally prepared. So what she would do is she would pack up her camping stove and she would hike dozens or sometimes even hundreds of miles out to these new mining claims, and she would pitch a tent, put up a sign that said meals for sale, and then would ply her trade cooking for all these ill-prepared miners. So that is how she became a unparalleled backcountry cook. Eventually, in the year 1900, she and her first husband opened a roadhouse, and this is them standing in front of it right now. And the two of them were both very well known drinkers, so their relationship involved a lot of screaming matches and broken furniture, and probably more than a couple mutual black eyes. But eventually in 1903, Fanny decided that she had had enough. And so she walked out of both her front door and her marriage. And she kept walking. So this is a map of Fanny's walk. It is 800 miles. You can see it starts across the Canadian border in the town of Dawson and follows the course of the Yukon River to Rampart, Alaska, which is fairly close to Fairbanks. And just to give a little bit of context for people who haven't spent time in Alaska, this is how big Alaska is when placed against the lower 48. So Fanny essentially did the equivalent of walking across the entire Midwest. She eventually followed Whispers of Gold to Kantishna, which is an area deep in what would eventually become Denali National Park. And at that point, there were no roads, and so everything had to be brought in arduously via dog sled. While she was living out in Kantishna, this is where she met long-legged Joe Quigley. I don't have to tell you which one he is in this picture. The two of them lived together for over a decade before they got married, but everyone just always called them man and wife from the beginning because there was so much stigma about unmarried cohabitation. So Fanny's dreams of striking it rich from gold never quite panned out, but while she was living in Kantishna, this is where she honed the skills that would eventually be the foundation of her reputation as a backcountry cook. So she learned to hunt bear, moose, and caribou. This is her on a hunting trip. I think most people assume that Fanny is in the middle, but Fanny is actually on the far left. She generally preferred to wear men's clothes. She found them to be more practical. She also taught herself how to trap, both for food and for pelts. She was mostly hunting for lynx, wolverine, and fox, and this is her with a pelt out in Kantishna. She was also an incredible gardener, and this is a picture of her cabin with raised garden beds built in front of it. Because the permafrost in Alaska is so close to the surface, you can't plant directly into the ground at that latitude. So you have to build raised beds to be able to grow in those environments. And she went so far as to plant grass so that when visiting dog sled teams would come through, she would be able to cut fresh grass for their bedding for the night. My favorite of her homesteading skills is she had a killer potato beer recipe, and she would use the temperature differentials in Joe's mine shafts as her own perfectly calibrated refrigeration system. So that's how she preserved things. She would just shuffle them around depending on what temperature she needed. My favorite story about Fanny is one time she was out hunting and was pretty far from her cabin when she saw a moose. And she knew that if she shot it and came back the next day, the scavengers would have taken it. So she instead shot it, cut it open, crawled inside, and spent the night in it. And she reported that in the morning, she had a heck of a time chipping her way out because the blood had frozen solid. But she was able to get her moose back home. The reason her story is known is because her and Joe's cabin was en route for mountaineering teams that were trying to claim the first summit of Mount McKinley, which has now been returned to its traditional Athabascan name of Denali. And so these mountaineers, when they came through, they would write about their expeditions and would often mention meeting Fanny as part of that. So I'm going to read you a quote from a 1913 article in Outing magazine. Our hostess was one of the most remarkable women I have ever met. She lived the wild life as the men did, and was as much at home in the open with a rifle as a city woman is on a city avenue. From a physical standpoint, she was a living example of what nature had intended a woman to be, and furthermore, while having the ability to do a man's work, she enjoyed life as a man does. Um, she definitely felt the isolation of her gender living out in Kantishna. For the majority of the time that she was there, she was literally the only woman, and she wrote this in a letter to a friend. I went to Fairbanks last fall. That was my first trip to town in 7 years. I didn't see woman for 3 years. I tell you, I got lonesome. All told, she spent over 30 years living out in Kantishna, and sadly, she and Joe divorced in 1937 after Joe fell in love with a nurse that he met while he was recovering from a mining injury. So he moved south with his new partner, and Fanny stayed out in Kantishna. And it's actually really sweet. All of the miners in the area banded together to build her a cabin. And because she was only 5 feet tall, everything is built to her specifications. Eventually, when she was 74 years old in 1944, she died alone in that cabin. And it seems like, by all accounts, she had built a cooking fire and lay down to take a nap before cooking dinner and just passed away peacefully in her sleep. So, this is a picture of her towards the end of her life on her porch. And if any of you ever find yourselves 90 plus miles into Denali National Park, you can go see her cabin, and I highly recommend doing so. This is Katie Brumbach, but she is better known as the Lady Hercules, or most popularly as the Great Sandwina. And she was one of at least 14 children born to Bavarian circus performers. She was born in the back of a circus wagon, so she was quite literally born into the trade. And she was doing handstands on her father's outstretched palms by the time she was 2 years old. The whole circus was a family affair, and one of the early acts that they used to do is her father, who was also a strong man, would offer 100 gold marks to anyone who could beat her in a wrestling contest. So when she was 16, her father threw this offer out to the crowd, and there was a young acrobat named Max who was in the audience, and he thought, oh, awesome, this is a great way to, make some easy money beating up a girl, and garner some publicity for my own circus career. So she, of course, destroyed him, but as he looked up from the ground on which she'd thrown him, he fell in love, and the feeling was mutual. So the two of them got married, and they remained married for 52 years. And that first picture I showed you of the Great Sandwina lifting a man above her head, that was her husband, Max. So she incorporated him into her act as a prop. Eventually, she branched off from the family circus and started performing as more of a solo act. And this is just a poster showing some of the performances that she would do. It's pretty impressive. In 1902, she crossed paths with the leading strong man of the era, and I want to explain to you how she ended up performing as the Great Sandwina. So basically what happened is the two of them decided that they wanted to have this public spectacle, and they decided what they would do is they would get together in an auditorium and they would lift progressively heavier weights until one of them couldn't do it anymore. And Brumbach succeeded when she was able to lift 300 pounds above her head with one hand, while Eugene Sandow was only able to lift that weight to his chest. So at this point, after she beated him in an act that was kind of equal parts homage and emasculation, she decided that she was going to take his name. So Sandwina is the female derivative of Sandow, and that is when she started performing as the Great Sandwina, and that's the name under which she's most commonly known. As her act progressed, it became more and more theatrical. So I'm just going to read you a magazine article about her act. Balancing on her chest of a revolving merry-go-round, through which half a dozen of a revolving merry-go-round with half a dozen adults, throwing from her body half a ton of stone, which had been placed on it with great difficulty by 8 men, while she concludes the turn by serving as the foundation of a bridge, over which pass, in double file, a number of people, followed by a fully grown cart horse. So this is a picture of that last act. Sadly, I could not find a photograph of the cart horse, but that's what comes next. She was really amazing for a number of reasons, and one of them was the way in which she embraced both her strength and her femininity. She didn't see any contradiction between her love of painting her nails and her ability to deflect sledgehammer blows to the chest. And she also defied gender conventions by speaking candidly about her sexuality. So, this is from an interview in a German newspaper. A very discreet question, my dear madame. Are you married? No, I'm still single, but nobody dares to end this situation. Are you interested in men anyway? What shall I say? Men are like air to me. You can't live without them. Every now and then, I breathe good fresh air, you know? So for the era, this is incredibly forward, and she would just talk about this. And this picture, I think, really epitomizes the way in which she was seen as both a strong woman and a sex symbol. And she was always described that way in the press. She was never written about in masculine terms. She eventually became a mother, and she performed up until the night before her first son was born. And of course, once he was born, she just incorporated him into the act as, another thing to toss around and lift. And during this whole time, she was an outspoken proponent of the women's right to vote. So in 1912, she became the vice president of the 800-member Barnum and Bailey Circus Suffragette Ladies. And that gave rise to what I think is maybe my favorite newspaper headline ever written. Happy family ruled by giantess makes anti-suffragists tremble. Just delightful. Eventually, when she was almost 60, she did retire from the circus, and she and Max opened a cafe in Ridgewood, New York, where you can see signs on the wall saying that it's owned by the world's strongest woman. And like everything else, this was a family affair. So Max served as the cook and her son was the bartender, and that left Katie free to be the amiable host. So she would still perform at this cafe. This is a picture of her performing at work. This is her holding a bed of nails while her two sons, one of whom was a heavyweight boxer, so no slouch, used sledgehammers to pound a bed of nails that she was holding away from her chest. So this is what you could watch while eating in their cafe. And she would also break iron bars to entertain cafe patrons upon request. This next image is my favorite one of everything that I found in this research. This is the great Sandwina and her husband Max still performing together in their cafe. It's just clear how much love there was between them. Sadly, she finally met her match in a fight against cancer, and she died in 1952 at the age of 67. This is Bessie Coleman, and she was a Texas aviatrix who was the first woman of African American and Native American descent to hold a pilot's license. She grew up in Texas and worked in cotton fields, and she did have some education, but basically at the time of year when the cotton harvest would happen, the school would be shut down, and so she wouldn't get a full education throughout the year. But her mother really believed in access to knowledge, and so she was able to get Bessie books from a passing library wagon. So Bessie eventually became a manicurist, but even then, she always said that she wanted to find a way to prove what her race was capable of. And the way she found to do this actually came through her brother, who had been in the military. And when he had been over in Europe, he had seen female pilots. So Bessie said, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. I will become a pilot. And her brother said, you N-word women ain't never going to fly. Not like those women I saw in France. So Bessie's response to that was to go to France. She found a newspaper that was willing to sponsor getting her over there, and she ended up getting her pilot's license from one of the most prestigious flying schools in France. During the 6 months that she was there, she was the only female student, and she talked about walking 9 miles to the airstrip each day. She came back to the US determined to become a stunt pilot to raise money to start the first African-American flying school. And the way that she was going to do this was by basically becoming as much of a sensation as possible and monetizing that. And she was the first documented public flight of a Black woman. And depending on which newspapers you read, The crowd for her first flight had anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 people watching. During this era, she was mostly ignored by white newspapers, but she did get a lot of coverage in Black newspapers. But it wasn't always positive. There was a lot of pushback against what she was doing. And so I just want to read a headline that's not about Bessie directly, but was from this era that said, "Colored women venturing too far from children, kitchen, clothes, and church." And I think it's just important to, again, talk about the broader context of where civil rights were in this era. She was really putting herself out there publicly in a way that was not safe. And even as she was drawing huge crowds for her shows, she talked about one chilling anecdote where, as she was up in the air, she could see just a few miles away, there was a KKK rally with over 2,000 people basically right next to where she was. So I just think it's really important to talk about how brave she was to be doing what she was doing during this era. She was a very adept marketer and understood that if she was going to open her flying school, she would need to get publicity and money in any way possible. And one of the ways it seemed like she might be able to do this was a New York film studio was interested in making a movie about her. And so she traveled to New York, not having seen the script. And when she got there, she saw that the opening scene called upon her to be dressed in rags, walking with a limp and a cane in broken English, and basically all sorts of just horribly racist stereotypes against African Americans. So in response, she said, "No Uncle Tom stuff for me," and she walked off the set and never came back. So she was very highly principled. She was flying during an era where planes were decidedly not reliable and plane crashes were quite common, and she had a couple crashes of her own. So that didn't stop her. And this is from an interview she gave from her hospital bed after one of her crashes. "Tell them all that as soon as I can walk, I'm going to fly. My faith in aviation and the useful of it will serve in fulfilling the destiny of my people isn't shaken at all." Sadly, when she was 34 in 1926, she had a crash that proved to be fatal. It later came to light that a mechanic who had been working on her plane had left a wrench loose in the engine compartment. And so it shook loose and jammed the controls, and she fell over 2,000 feet to her death. And because at this one point she was starting to have a pretty high profile, the instant her plane hit the ground, there were souvenir hunters rifling through the wreckage, trying to find things that they could keep. She really didn't get to see how far she could have gone in life, but she was recognized in death, and over 5,000 mourners showed up to her funeral, even though only 2,000 could fit within the church. So her coffin was actually taken to a number of different locations so that everyone who wanted to pay their respects was able to. A number of things were done in her honor. This is a stamp from 1992 for Black Heritage Month. And in 1977, a group of Black women student pilots formed the Bessie Coleman Aviation Club. And there's also an annual flyover of her grave that happens each year. I just want to end her story with one quote that I think really sums up how she felt about flying. She said, "The air is the only place free from prejudice." This is Helga Espy with her daughter Clara, and these are Washingtonian women. Helga was a Norwegian immigrant, and she and her husband Ole settled in Spokane. She had her first child at the age of 16, and by the time she was 35, she had given birth to 10 children. Two of them died pretty young, and this was pretty common for that era. Things were going fairly well for them. They owned a farm, but then Ole got injured and they weren't able to pay the mortgage. So they needed to find a way to raise money. And it was during this time that Helga heard of an anonymous wager where a wealthy benefactor was offering $10,000 to any woman who could walk across the United States in under 7 months. And Helga decided this was the best way to save the farm. So this is a map of the route they ended up taking. And because there wasn't an interstate road system at this point, they were following the railroad lines. The two of them packed a red pepper pistol and a curling iron, and they set off in 1896. Unfortunately for them, This was during one of the worst winters in recent memory, and so the first 10 days of their trip were in ceaseless pouring rain. And they wrote about getting to a Scandinavian town after just being cold and wet and miserable for a week and a half. And they were so excited at the prospect of a warm meal and a dry place to sleep. But sadly, the occupants of the town, their fellow Scandinavian immigrants, thought that what they were doing was improper and immoral, particularly Helga, because she was a mother. And so, even though the two of them had money, no one would sell them food, no one would give them a room, and they instead spent the night cold and alone in a train depot. As they were doing this walk, they had to contend with the elements. Like I said, they left during a very rainy winter, and so they were dealing with floods, having to ford rivers, heavy snowfall over mountain passes. And I just wanted to read you a little quote about what they did when they encountered mountain lions. Being acquainted with the animal's traits, we knew they never attacked from behind, and never except by running and springing upon a victim. We kept up a steady pace and kept the animal about 10 feet behind us. So that is how they nonchalantly dealt with mountain lions. I think it's just really indicative of how just how cavalier they were about the fact that they were facing these really terrifying things. Another thing that they had to contend with, because they were following the railroad lines, the heat that would accrue on the railroad ties made them very enticing for snakes that wanted to sun themselves. And so they described the terrain as being so thick with rattlesnakes as to make it almost impossible to get along. They also had to contend with male harassment. There is one instance where they were being followed by a man who would not leave them alone. And eventually, Helga was forced to shoot him in the leg. And she reported later that she was pleased that the police deemed it self-defense and she was not arrested. And this is a newspaper article showing them defending themselves. Sadly, this is yet another story with a sad ending. Two of them did successfully walk across the United States, but once they got there, the anonymous benefactor never appeared. And the two of them ended up stranded on the East Coast and couldn't even raise the money to get home. They took jobs in a factory and wrote to every newspaper outlet, really anybody they had met on their travels, just trying to cobble together enough money to get back to Spokane and their family. But sadly, two of Helga's children had died of illness while she was gone, and her family really felt that she had betrayed them. So eventually they did find a sponsor to buy them train tickets back, but when they returned, the family really just felt that Helga had abandoned her duties as a mother and that this whole thing had been just a mistake that abandoned them. And they did something that is pretty heartbreaking. Helga and Clara had been keeping journals and copious notes because they eventually wanted to write a book of their journey, but their family took all of those journals and notes and they burned them. And the only reason that the story survived is one descendant felt that wasn't the right thing to do. And so they saved the book of press clippings from this trip. So none of those original journals and sketches survive, but the records and newspapers as they made their way across the country were documented. And through that, the story was able to be pieced back together. There's another twist of how this story survived, which is an English teacher gave an assignment to her students for them to write about one of their ancestors. And one of her students showed up with an essay about his, great, possibly three greats grandmother walking across Victorian America. And this teacher became so fascinated that she actually took it upon herself to research this story, and she wrote an amazing book about it. So at this point, there's that book, and then there's another book written by one of Helga's descendants, and her story is alive and well. But it's pretty amazing how close this story came to being completely lost. And yeah, I mean, really, the documentation means everything. The last woman that I'm going to tell you about is Fanny Bullock Workman, and she could be in this talk for any number of reasons. As a cyclist, a mountaineer, a cartographer, a geologist, a geographer, a lecturer, an author. She was a polymath. And she was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1859 into a pretty well-to-do, high-class household. But she always chafed against the social expectations of a woman of her class. She eventually ended up marrying William Hunter Workman, a doctor who was about 10 years her senior, and he fundamentally changed her life because he introduced her to mountain climbing. So Fanny started climbing while living in New England, and the alpine clubs of the era and that region were actually very surprisingly progressive. So they were co-ed from the outset, and Fanny started climbing in the company of other women. So what this did is it made her decide that she always wanted to couple her love of the outdoors with her sense of gender activism. The way that the Workmans are most well known were as cyclists, and they had two kids and they would leave them in the care of nursemaids while they took off for international bike trips. And this is a picture of Fanny on one of those trips. You can see that she insisted on cycling in full skirts, even though by this era it was becoming increasingly more acceptable for women to wear bloomers. Their first big trip was through Italy, France, and Switzerland, and I think that one was about 400 miles. But after that trip, their only son died, and in her grief, Fanny really sought out an identity outside of motherhood, and that's when their trip started becoming longer and more ambitious. So this is a book, Sketches a Wheel in Modern Iberia, about a 3,000-mile trip that they took across Spain. And this is one of 8 books that they would eventually go on to co-author. And this was just a prelude for their really ambitious long journey, which was through town and jungle, 14,000 miles a wheel among the temples and people of the Indian plain. And you can see here that both William and Fanny would list themselves as authors and list their affiliations and accomplishments just to really show that they were equals. And if anything, Fanny was the more accomplished of the two. So these are some pictures from some of their travels. You can see them fording a river in a dugout canoe. You can see their bikes in the middle there. This is Fanny in front of a temple. This is a picture from one of their camp setups. So they definitely were not traveling light. Like I said, they were pretty high class. So they were probably what we would now call glamping for many of their trips. So eventually, once they reached the base of the Himalayas, they swapped out gear and traded their bicycles for ropes. And this is where Fanny set off to set a series of female altitude records that would stand unbroken for over 20 years. And this is a picture of their climbing outfits and what they would wear when they went out into the mountains. And it should also be noted that Fanny was very interested in geology. She didn't want to just be an adventurer. She really wanted to have science and education be very tied up in what she was doing. So a lot of their writings are really about the topography and science behind the places that they would go. I mentioned earlier that she really doubled down on an identity outside of motherhood, and it could be argued that she maybe took that a little bit too far because the two of them actually missed their only daughter's wedding because they were out exploring the Karakoram Glacier. This is a picture of them at one of their mountaineering camps, just to give you a sense of what their setup was. This image is far and away the most famous picture of Fanny, and in this, she is standing at 21,000 feet of elevation. The year is 1912, and she is holding a newspaper with the headline, "Votes for Women." So she was a very strong proponent of women's suffrage. It was a cause that she deeply believed in. Fanny eventually died in France in 1925, but she left behind large endowments at 4 women's colleges in New England. And so to this day, there are still fellowships available in her name. So this concludes the section of this talk where I tell you about amazing women in history. And I wish I had time to tell you more because when I first started researching this topic, I'm a freelance artist and writer, and I thought that this would be a fun thing to do for, a couple of months until I ran out of women. And I'm happy to report I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. And this is just scratching the surface of the stories that are out there. But one of the things that I really love about the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau is that they try and fill their roster with talks that really connect these topics of inquiry with the ways in which we actually live now. So I want to shift gears into a broader question. Why do the stories of these women matter now? And to answer this, I want to explain what initially led me to this topic of strong, curious, adventurous women. So, almost exactly a decade ago, I was supposed to be getting married. And I set off on a solo bike trip with the idea that I would get my pesky restlessness out of my system and come back ready to settle down and, accept I'd had some good adventures and become somebody's wife. Not surprisingly, that is not what happened. I instead ended up calling off an engagement while illegally camped in a West Texas cow pasture, and then biking 3,000 more miles. And I did end up finding a life partner just in the form of my bicycle. So once I found some geographic distance from a man who loved me as something he possessed and told me how much freedom I was allowed to want, I found myself again. I found my way out of a controlling, emotionally abusive relationship by means of a 5,000-mile bike ride. But during my 4 months on the road, I heard the same thing every single day. A woman can't travel alone. And at the beginning of this trip, I was pretty timid and polite about responding. I would say something like, I do believe you might perhaps be slightly mistaken there. But after something like 130 back-to-back iterations, coupled with men telling me on a daily basis that I was crazy, stupid, naive, and incapable of doing what I was actively in the process of happily doing, I got a little feistier about it. Sweetheart, you have no idea just how deeply wrong you are. In my own case, I felt both confused and ashamed that I had lost myself within a toxic relationship. But what I came to understand is that we can only pursue those horizons that we can envision. And I hadn't encountered a narrative that showed me I had a choice. I hadn't heard a story that told me I was allowed to yearn for something that was beyond what my society had modeled for me. I found myself becoming owned because I didn't have the counterexamples that I desperately needed. And on my own, I wasn't strong enough to fight the generational echoes of a system that told me I wasn't allowed to belong to myself. So I started researching this topic because I wanted the strength of 150 years of backup. And these women are remarkable because they crafted options that simply didn't exist. They didn't have role models, they didn't have communities, they had no support networks. By today's standards, they wrestled their independence out of thin air. But we're living in another moment of technological reinvention. And so I want to dip back to this technology timeline. The internet basically only sprung into existence in 1990, and the first messaging system, AOL Instant Messenger, came along in 1993. Another fun trivia note, the first message ever sent over that platform was from a husband to his wife, and he said, "Don't be scared, it is me." Facebook only came along in 2004, and the iPhone was only invented in 2007. So I just want us all to take a moment to appreciate that we are less than a decade and a half into this whole experiment of smartphones, and look at how it has changed absolutely everything about how we communicate and interact with each other. Now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of platforms that exist solely to help us share and broadcast stories about our lives. In the early 1900s, the way that these women chose to live mattered and mattered deeply. But the available means of communication were such that the impacts of their life stories were limited because very few people heard about them. So they end up standing as scattered exemplary stars lost against the larger night sky of history. But their stories, and maybe more importantly, the records of those stories still exist. And we can dig up these narratives and rebroadcast them through today's platforms. It's certainly an interesting moment to be a woman in America, and the feelings of helplessness, frustration, exhaustion, and rage are palpable and real. And I want to shift gears for a moment with a 2020 update, which is still accurate in 2021. I made this talk originally in 2018 at the height of the Me Too movement, but I really feel that it's important in giving a talk about feminism and female empowerment to discuss the importance of intersectionality and larger systems of power. So while it's great to talk about what these incredibly strong women were doing, we also can't talk about them in isolation. So I want to talk about the fact that I'm using the term intersectionality. That is something that came from a Black legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. And a lot of the ideas that have made their way into mainstream feminism initially came from women of color who were largely not credited. I'm also talking about Me Too. That's something that was coined by activist Tarana Burke. Again, a movement started by a woman of color who's largely been left out of later conversation. Language that we use, say her name, identity politics, these again are coming from Black women. So I just want to read a quote from Toni Morrison that I think really addresses the fact that feminism, particularly white feminism, often focuses on the ways in which women are oppressed without also talking about the power and responsibility that they hold to also look at race. Your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. So I just wanted to kind of take a moment to step back and say the importance of talking about systems of power, that feminism needs to have an intersectional lens, because I would be remiss in giving this talk without emphasizing that. So we are living in a really interesting moment where things are contentious. We are obviously trying to figure out how to tell the new sorts of stories that we need. And within that, I find a sense of hope because our modern capacities for mass communication are allowing us to shift the conversation from the individual to the systemic. And the lives of these 7 women are an integral part of what has already been a very long fight. And if we share their stories through the methods that we have available today, what we're able to see is that these women were never aberrations. They were instead redefinitions. They were paving the way for all of the women who came after them. And what we are able to see is that they were never actually just scattered stars. They were instead a part of a large and fierce constellation. I believe that the strongest critique of a system lies in demonstrating the viability of living outside of it. And women need role models who can demonstrate that they are allowed to desire freedom on their own terms. But this message can only change horizons if it is received, and the physical heft of these women's lives mattered deeply. In a very real way, these 7 women set me free. They gave me permission to define freedom for myself. And spreading their stories is something that I consider both a joy and an obligation. So I'd like to end this talk with a passage that Fanny Bullock Workman wrote in her book, 2 Summers in the Ice Wilds of the Eastern Karakoram. The object of placing my full name in connection with the Siachen Glacier expedition is not because I wish in any way to thrust myself forward, but solely that in the accomplishments of women, now and in the future, it should be known to them and stated in print that a woman was the initiator and special leader of this expedition. When later, women occupies her acknowledged role as an individual worker in all fields, as well as those of exploration, no such emphasis of her work will be needed. But the day has not fully arrived. And at present, it behooves women, for the benefit of their sex, to put what they do, at least on record. The lives of these 7 women fought for gender equity during the eras in which they lived, and the stories of their amazing lives can continue that fight now. Thank you for letting me share their stories.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was fabulous.
Thanks. I think since we
Yes,
have
thank.
yeah, if we could just unmute and have a Q&A and chat it out.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Let me just first really quickly say thank you, Tessa. That was amazing. I'm actually going to show it to my girls. I have 2 little girls at home. There's an evaluation in the chat. Please, everybody who's on this, click into that evaluation and fill out that evaluation. It's how Humanities Washington, wonderful organization, gets their funding so they can support programs like this. I feel like PBS. But let's have everybody unmute themselves and we can do a quick Q&A. And I am recording, so don't say anything too embarrassing. Yeah, I'll let Tessa take it away. I'm gonna shut my mic off.
If we don't complete the evaluation before the Zoom is over, I just opened it. It's in a tab and online. I can do that after the Zoom is closed, correct?
Yeah, you can do it anytime.
Okay.
I'm looking in the chat. I'm seeing Heidi said that her mother used a brownie beginning in the 1920s. That's really cool.
I had a heck of a time getting on this. I had to literally type in every single letter and number that was, it took me forever. And so I missed the beginning of this. Is there a chance that I can see it? I see it's being recorded. Is there a way to see it again?
Sorry, if you send me an email, I'll put my email in the chat to everybody.
Thank you.
I will send you a link to the recording.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, just use it. We're keeping it private to the Hearthstone. So
I'll just look at it and delete it if you want.
Share it. Just tell everybody that it's private and
I won't post it anywhere.
Yeah, fantastic.
I really liked your graphics. Did you do them yourself?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I'm kind of equal parts writer and visual artist, and actually what I am working on and have been working on for the last 6 years is a nonfiction graphic novel. So that is that's the main thing that I do. So I'm in book deadline mode these days, and so I pretty much don't do anything except chain my drawing table.
Thank you. I especially love the stars and then the we can't. So thank you.
Yeah, so did you draw the pictures of all those women? Wow, you're really good. Is your book about these women?
No. So it's funny, giving this talk, everyone's always saying, oh, are you going to write a book about this? But actually the book that I'm working on is, the Cliff Notes version is that my grandmother was a journalist in Shanghai during the communist takeover, and she ended up having an affair with a Swiss diplomat and ended up a single mother raising a mixed race bastard child while being persecuted by the communist government. And so eventually my grandmother was able to smuggle herself and my mom out of the country in 1957. And so they fled to Hong Kong beneath the false bottom of a fishing boat. And once they got there, my grandma wrote a memoir called 8 Years in Red Shanghai, Love, Starvation, Persecution, that was about this period of being a single mother while being persecuted. And so that book became an immediate bestseller in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And my grandma used the money from that to put my mom into an elite Hong Kong boarding school, which is where my mom learned to speak English. And then sadly, after my mom was safe, my grandmother had a mental breakdown and was diagnosed as schizophrenic and then later reversed to bipolar disorder. But she was basically institutionalized throughout the 1960s. So my mom, who had never met her father, was essentially raised as an orphan by her boarding school. And when my mom immigrated to the US on a college scholarship, she met my grandmother.
Schedule an appointment for you concerning your elbow issues. Please give us a call at 206.
Audio. But anyways, that is what my book is about. And
Oh my God.
I'm under publication deadline, so I have to finish it by the end of the year. I am on track to do that. So it'll be released in early 2023, but basically until I'm done with that, I cannot do anything else.
Right, yeah. Well, graphic,
What's it called?
there's so much more labor intensive than just writing a book. Holy,
Oh yeah.
oh
Yeah,
yeah.
and my stuff actually is usually really, really detailed. So yeah, kind of what you're seeing in this talk is that's not indicative of the level of detail what I usually do. And I think someone asked for the title. It's called Feeding Ghosts.
Called what? What is it
Feeding
again?
Ghosts. Feeding
Feeding?
Ghosts. Feeding Ghosts. And it'll be out from MCD Books.
2023.
Yes, that is the plan, early 2023.
So how many other stories of fabulous women do you have?
Oh, dozens. There's so many. And the ones that I picked for this talk, you know, whenever possible, I try and find women of color because they are most often the ones erased from history. And oftentimes, you know, because so much of this is about communications technology and documentation, there's a lot of women where you can find maybe one picture of them and there's, you know, there's the one famous image. And so there's dozens and dozens. And you know, that was one of the criteria for me of the women that I included for this, as I wanted ones where I could find enough images. So that unfortunately excludes a lot of stories because documentation is just really tricky. But yeah, there's really no end to how many there are. And at this point, I have a pretty robust resource library. And so what I do is whenever possible, I'll find the primary documents because obviously everything is long out of copyright. You know, there's these amazing, you know, Project Gutenberg digital archives where you can actually just go read all of these as free PDFs. And then I'll go to the bibliographies of everything that I read, find all the books there, go read those. And what's really neat is you start to see how, you know, the same characters pop up. You start to get a sense of really what the larger context of history was in that time. So as I've researched more, you know, it gets smaller and smaller in a way that's actually really inspiring.
Yeah. So what are you going to do with all those stories?
Think about them when I have finished my graphic novel.
Hey, can I suggest we get a part 2 here?
Yeah.
At some point. You obviously put a ton of work into it. And I would love to see the graphic novel. You know, I know it's going to be on the shelves of like Elliott Bay, but we could put it on the shelves of the library here. I mean, it sounds really interesting. And it would be great if you could do a graphic novel on this subject as well. I mean, I know that they take forever to do. So that's one issue because you're writing and drawing.
Yeah. I mean, I do actually one of before I completely got sucked into book deadline mode, the Adventure Cycling Association, they have a magazine called Adventure Cyclist. And so I was doing single page comics about women in cycling history for them as an ongoing series. So I have turned none of the women that I did one on Fanny Bullock Workman for them, but I have done some comics that condense all this information onto one page. That's fun. That's something I'd love to start doing again when I get my life back.
Yes. There's a woman named Mary something, Hunter of Peace from the Canadian Rockies. I can't remember her last name, but there was a book called Hunter of Peace. And I remember her first name was Mary. And it was it was a really interesting story about.
I love the way you, when you finished your lecture on the women, you had a wonderful matrix to put all this in, and I appreciate that very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I loved hearing the word feminist. Thank you.
You said something about Project Gutenberg. Where did you start your research? Which library, or how did you start digging into it?
I mean, first step was just a lot of Googling and sort of seeing where that led. And one of the things that's really interesting, because I have written some freelance pieces on some of these women, is you really start to see the way in which researchers who don't want to do as much of a deep dive, you know, you'll sort of see the echo chamber of the internet, where if there's a high profile piece on, you know, a fairly large platform, then other people will start writing pieces on it, but they're always taking the same, you know, the same quote that was in that article when that quote was taken from a full book. So I'll just start by Googling things to kind of get a sense of the terrain that I then want to explore in a more analog fashion. So I usually, what I do, I'll create a Google Doc for every woman that I'm researching, and I'll just keep track of all the links, and I'll make a spreadsheet and sort of notes to myself. And then I love books. I love reading.
So then you do make your way into libraries, or is there a database still in existence that has every library's contents
no,
on it? There used to be stuff like that. I think it's all disappeared.
As the librarian in the group, I'm a degree librarian. It's called WorldCat, the World Catalog, worldcat.org. And Project Gutenberg is really cool because they take all of the books that are out of copyright and they put them on their website to read or sometimes listen to. And some of the recordings are actually pretty good. Some of them are done by robots and they're not very good, but that's where you can read all your Dickens and your Dostoevsky. You know, it's all there. It's amazing.
So is microfiche something that anybody ever uses anymore? Is all that transposed?
Yeah.
So you can go and sit in a microfiche machine.
Well, you know, and
Or
one thing that
microfilm.
one thing that I really, you know, before everything switched to Zoom, I really loved the fact that the Speakers Bureau, you know, we get sent all over Washington State. And I know that for some of the speakers, they're kind of like, oh, you know, that's a lot of work. Whereas for me, like, I just bring my mountain bike and my backpacking gear, and I'm just like, great, it's the best excuse to go out. But as part of that, you know, a lot of places that host me are historical societies or libraries. And a lot of the times, you know, I'll be in communication with librarians and historians before I go to speak. And so they'll pull things from their collections to show me. And, you know, the number of images that make their way to availability on the internet is just such a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what's out there. And there's nothing like boots on the ground. There's nothing like putting on your white glove. And that's what I love. Like, I love nothing more than being tossed into an archive just to see what's there. And again, we're not in deadline.
I think it's a real shortcoming in modern society. People do not remember or even ever have an experience with how deep the dive is in a library. So
and you know, sometimes I feel like I'm a little bit of anachronism as a woman in my mid-30s who is, you know, always talking about like paper books, analog research. But I do think that, you know, the generation just below mine who never lived in an era before the internet is, I think that it's easy to believe that everything is online. And it's not. It's just absolutely not.
I think it's going to have to be something that gets added to curriculum in the early days of school, so people start learning. Our history is going to get lost. People like you will bring it alive, but the librarians of the world have to unite and start marching out there and kidnapping children.
Well, and, you know, I do feel like libraries in general do a very amazing job of pivoting to meet the needs of a changing and evolving culture. And you know, I think librarians are I love librarians. I think that they are a force for such social and cultural good. But yeah, I mean, I do think there's something that's lost when you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
Great point. As a librarian, I would always walk, especially kids, to the shelf. I'd say, let's do a little shelf read because you're in the Dewey Decimal number for such and such. That means what? I don't know. Okay. That means it's arranged by subject. Okay. This is the book you wanted, but look at this section of the stuff you wanted. And then they could cherry pick the best parts of all these different books. And then they'd go from getting a C to getting an A, and also becoming big fans of research. And then it just goes on to archives and microfilm and microfiche. And there, as small a percentage of stuff as there is online, there's more and more growing every day. Like Library of Congress has amazing archives, and even your local library does too. I served Everett, and Everett has a really good history page if you want to read about the history of Everett. Lots of images, just amazing. Anyway, you got me started about libraries. We're not talking about libraries.
I know.
But I want to thank
Sorry.
Tessa. Thank you. It was such a great presentation. Please fill out that evaluation. If anybody wants to see the recording, share it with someone you trust. Feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to send it to you once I get it up on YouTube. And I think we'll just we'll end it here. Unless anyone has any final questions or thoughts.
So you
No,
are
you're
putting it on
fabulous.
YouTube, huh?
Wonderful.
Okay,
Thank
thanks
you.
everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everyone. Bye.